To this day, I get a feeling of excitement and anxiety as my flight flies over Cuban territory. I'm amazed at how much the rich Cuban farmland sits fallow, many fields covered in marabou weeds. And as I head towards the hotel, I get that funny feeling of homecoming.
I was born here many years ago and left as a child and returned for the first time at the age of 49 in 2000. Since then, I've come to Havana at least 8 times, and I was asked to do this to see if I could see any change after the Obama relaxations and rule between the two countries.
What some have called normalization of relations between the two countries was achieved by President Obama in December of 2014. Although far from normalized relations, the changes were more of a relaxation of the long-standing animosities between Cuba and the United States. The United States reopened its interest section in Havana as the embassy, made it possible for American air carriers to fly to Cuba, cruise ships to dock in Cuba, and it allowed some American companies to do very limited business in Cuba. It also relaxed travel restrictions. In May, I traveled to the island with a group of friends. We visited my hometown of Havana and the western provinces. The streets of my Havana are relatively unchanged from the days of my childhood. And a trip to my old neighborhood brings back memories. The facade of our apartment building, the corner grocery store, my grandmother's apartment around the corner with a distinctive iron work on the balcony.
To the naked eye, not much has changed in reality. There's still fewer cars on the streets. There's lots of the old cars on the street which are not environmentally friendly. Transportation is still a huge problem for many Cubans who do not have a car. Food is still at a shortage, although I'm told that no Cubans go hungry.
With every trip comes new experiences. This year, it was a visit to tobacco country in the west end of the island. En route, there was a stop at Las Terrazas, a planned community built by the Revolution and designated a biosphere reserve by UNESCO in 1984. Its early residents helped to plant new trees to reforest the adjoining mountain range. Also on the western jaunt was an overnight at the bucolic Viñales Valley, where limestone formations called mogotes accented the landscape. We also got a crash course in tobacco growing from Mr. Montesinos, a tobacco grower outside of Viñales, and toured the drying barns.
Entonces, para hacer un tabaco, se le retira el nervio central.
So, in order to make a cigar, you just take away the center stem of the leaf.
Vamos a utilizar las dos partes.
And then you use both the two sides then of the leaf.
Entonces se va a hacer, para esta hoja se van a utilizar dos tabacos, uno izquierdo, otro derecho.
Oh, there will be one cigar that is going to be on the right, and one is going to be on the left.
¿Ve? Según la posición de los nervios.
Depending on the position of the nerves of the stems.
Sombrero.
And then we put in the final part, which is called the hat.
Muy importante. Porque es que le va a dar el terminado.
Because will be the finishing part, like the real aesthetic of the tobacco, of the cigar.
So you cut both ends when you're smoking them?
No, just the hat part. The other
Y-
one is
He'll
open.
let
It's
you
open.
know.
The other
Y
one is
dentro de una semana,
Just a tad. Oh, okay, I see. Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
dentro de una semana, está listo para fumar.
And in 1 week, it will be ready to be smoked.
I like it.
We also visited the provincial capital, Pinar del Rio City, population around 190,000, Cuba's 10th largest city. It's a far cry from Havana, but a nice respite from Havana's hustle and bustle. Cuba has been welcoming tourists from around the world since the early days of the Castro Revolution in 1959. But one of the changes I noticed on my trips this year has been the increase in travelers from the United States. Most of these travelers are going to Cuba on people-to-people educational trips, one of the 12 categories under which Americans are allowed to travel to Cuba. Even though there was a spike in American travelers after the December 2014 announcements, interest has leveled off. In January, I accompanied a class from the UWM School of Architecture and Urban Planning, led by UWM adjunct professor Michael Martin.
Problems that places like Camilo Cienfuegos, Ciudad Camilo Cienfuegos, and Alimar, which is just up the road and has further problems with this, is the social isolation away from economic support systems.
Martin's class took students to neighborhoods throughout Havana and the outskirts and provided a rare opportunity to visit CUHI, the Architecture and Engineering College of the University of Havana.
A very famous architectural historian said that the TV killed the porch, because now people sit inside and watch TV all the time. But the porch was obviously a focal point of a lot of the architectural design.
What I call the contradiction of Cuba continues to persist. Tourism and activities related to tourists continue to thrive. There's been an explosion in the number of paladares, private restaurants located in people's homes, which have raised the quality of food on the island. In my travel to the island in the early 2000s, there were very few dining options and only a handful of dependable paladares. In 2017, however, paladares are thriving. While the food options for tourists multiply, the options for the Cubans themselves, however, have made little or no progress. With a finite amount of food produced and imported on the island, the Cubans find themselves struggling to put meals on the table.
At the home of Ernest Hemingway, folks, on the other side of the Havana Bay in a small town called San Francisco de Paula. And it just goes to show you that there has been long and deep connections between the States and Cuba, and that as a kid, I experienced many American influences, everything from watching The Lone Ranger on TV to going to Woolworth's downtown Havana, and watching the Globetrotters out at the Ciudad Deportiva. So, Finca Vigía, Ernest Hemingway's home. We're in the town of Regla, across the harbor from Old Havana in the city of Havana. You see Old Havana in the background, as well as the little launch that takes people across the bay every day.
Regla, on the east side of the Havana Bay, is accessible on the little ferries which leave the terminal throughout the day. It's a hotbed of Afro-Cuban religion and the home of the Black Virgin of Regla, who is venerated on the island, and whose image is associated with the Santeria goddess Yemaya, the Orisha of the ocean. Music is ever present on the island, whether in clubs, outdoor cafes, and schools. One of the highlights of our trip in May was meeting the talented students at the Escuela Paulita Concepcion in Centro Habana, where we enjoyed our own private concert. And on our last night, we enjoyed some Cuban-infused jazz at Havana's famed La Zorra y el Cuervo Club with renowned Cuban drummer Yissy Garcia and her band. My last revelation of the May trip was the discovery of Fusterlandia, the home and neighborhood of Jose Fuster, a Cuban artist who in a little over 20 years has transformed his house and neighborhood into a fantasy land.
Final day here from Jose Marti International Airport in Havana. We're headed back home today and wanted to share some final reflections with you. It seems to me that President Obama's changes have begun to normalize the economy. Tourists have much more to choose from in terms of food, in terms of housing options. However, I think the plight of the regular Cuban, I've spoken to many friends who echo the same sentiment that, you know, things are very, very difficult. It hasn't gotten any better from them unless you're involved in the tourist economy, which can help you. But all in all, Cubans are still having a really drastic time moving forward. Younger people are discouraged. They see very little hope coming up. You know, time will see what happens in Cuba in the next decade.